Good morning and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Watcast. Q and I are really excited to be back today to just continue some really great conversation. There's a lot to learn, a lot coming that I'm super excited about, and Q's going to share with us what today is going to look like.
Yeah, good morning, guys. We're going to be having on Brittany Melton, Dr. Melton. She is the professor of Old Testament here at PBA. You might have had her for your ETB class, Exploring the Bible, if you were a freshman. And if you're more on the ministry side of majors and things like that, you're well acquainted with her classes. So Josh is going to be talking to her a lot about hospitality and what that actually means in the church and for us as Christians, which is going to be just such an awesome conversation. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Brittany Melton.
All right. Welcome, Dr. Melton. It is great to have you with us this morning to talk with us a little bit about hospitality. And you don't know that I'm going to say this, but it is something that I have observed that you are gifted in, is living life with a spirit of hospitality. And to quote a mutual friend of ours, Emily Blaylock, in introducing you once when you were about to preach a sermon in church, she said that you are someone that creates a space for her to be free to grow and free to be herself. And I've felt that same experience sitting in your home, sitting in class with you, and even just in your office and in other spaces. And so I'm just thrilled to have you on this morning and talk with us about hospitality and what that looks like in our lives and our own experiences of it. And so to sort of kick off the conversation, I'd love to just ask you very simply, sort of in as broad or specific as you'd like to be, what is this thing that we call hospitality?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Broad would look like my endeavor toward a whole Old Testament theology / biblical theology of hospitality. So probably that's a little bit too much for this session, but is something that I am working on and would like to complete in more maturity after I've had more maturity in life. As a kind of key aspect of my research. It's interesting because right now my work is more focused on placedness. And so there's a lot of talk theologically about the difference between space and place. So that place is particular. And so I think in that sense, it's an important thing, I think, for us to see the difference between those. Because so often we think all we need is space or all we need is time to kind of grow. But what I'm finding in a lot of my work is how important the particularity of people or place is in order for us to cultivate this growth, or in order for us to facilitate hospitality, we have to already be rooted in place, or rooted more firmly in God and who we are. So that's my random tangent based on my current research and where I'm going. So what is hospitality? When I first started thinking about this, I like to kind of theologically think about what's my theological baggage, and then how. So actually, like a very exercise and interpretation would be, how do I strip out like my cultural lens and like see what maybe I'm bringing to the text that is not really there. Yeah. And so in that, for me, I had to unpack a lot of the kind of Southern hospitality and like 1950s overlay of like the embodiment of that, looking like housewives serving like perfect food and looking perfect and all of those things. And so then realizing it wasn't even just the taking out of those aspects, but coming around to like actually almost the complete opposite of those aspects when we look at biblical hospitality being something that invites people into the mess of like real life. And it's not this kind of moment of, picturesque life on Instagram, but it ends up being this like walking alongside over a period of time. And so it kind of like was the opposite of all the categories of the kind of moment, perfect moment actually became a like continued relationship that you don't know where it's going instead of this like catered thing. So in kind of all those different facets, I found how much it's like in the Bible, you just have like all of a sudden Abraham just has these visitors drop in, or like when we have like anytime there's like a messenger angelic visitation, there's like lots of other aspects we could think about. But more often than not, when we have examples in the Bible where it's actually focusing on hospitality, it's an unexpected moment where we're like invited in to respond with openness.
I love that. There's this sort of spirit of authenticity in that hospitality is real, and if it's not real, it's not hospitality. And I've heard you speak a little bit before on some of the differences between hospitality and entertainment in conversation with one another as like who is what I'm doing for, in that spirit of like even Southern hospitality and this culture of proper manners and politeness and exaggerated politeness, even at times, and having like your perfect home ready before like hosting a dinner party, those kinds of things, versus someone just being present in what's going on in life, and sort of that conversation between entertainment and true hospitality and what those look like. Could you unpack that just a little bit?
For me, I think a lot about actually our time in the UK, where we were outside of our like cultural norms, and all of a sudden, like if someone invited you over for like Sunday lunch, it was like you didn't realize at first you were getting roped into this like 4 or 5 hour like whenever afternoon of just being together. And it wasn't as if like once you ate, then there was this, and then you were just out the door. But it was this kind of like, you're coming over, and then if it turns into like we're gonna have this snack, and then you just kind of stay around. There was never that same sense of the kind of to-do list that I often feel like in American culture I experienced, of like if you go out to dinner with someone, typically you're going out rather than into their house. But even if you go into their house, there's this like, I better not overstay. I better just stay my, 1 hour, or we've already booked something just to the other side of this. So we couldn't possibly even have margin to stay and just kind of like be in a relationship. And so that for me was really life-giving. And so the example in my mind when you were talking was actually for Christmas, it was really inconvenient once we had kids to like go back and forth over Christmas Day with this family we spent time with. So we actually just stayed for like 3 days with our friends' parents, and just stayed in their extra room. And like the house is a total disaster. My kids are all over the place. But like those memories were so much sweeter because it was just like living life together for several days. And so just Allison, the mom of this family, I feel like she is someone that for me like just shows the kind of priority system of like she's still making like lovely food, but it's like, who can do this? You know, it's just kind of like bringing people into that instead of like the entertaining aspect. To me, it's almost like there's this wall of like, there's the person in the kitchen and the people out here being entertained. And I feel like that's like probably a really helpful metaphor of like, is there actually any like exchange or transformation taking place, or is it more just like a service that glorifies the person serving, or kind of like in a negative way, right? Just like is about presentation and what you can get out of it instead of like what we're sharing. Yeah,
I think that the last bit reminds me very much of like Mary and Martha with Jesus.
We read that last night in my kids' children's Bible, which, if you know very much about us, is just terrible, because between Drew and I, we like criticize all the different ways that the stories are imaged. And we're like, oh, that's actually like a good one. So we like go across all these different children's Bibles for examples. But that's hilarious. Yes, Mary and Martha was up last night. I think because Afton just likes the women in this story. But nice. Anyway, Mary and Martha.
Just Mary and Martha, and the difference between the two of them that we see, where one is even with wonderful intention of serving, one seems to miss that togetherness that's happening in the other room, where Jesus is just present, and we're just present with people, and they're just present together. And so just that came to mind just real quick. And so where does this sort of desire and yearning for hospitality come from in our lives?
Yeah. So for me, I'm always thinking like theological foundation is like, who is God? And so therefore, like, who are we? And so there would be all like kinds of places we could go in scripture to talk about God being a hospitable God and giving us like a world to live in, giving Israel a land and like an identity and all of these things. But that God creates us to feel at home, I think is something that we sometimes miss out of the Old Testament when we just like jump to the New Testament and think about like the new heaven and the new earth. We can sometimes have like that escapism of like, this isn't my home. And it's like, how do you hold the tension between those? And so that for me helps to kind of explore like both sides of it. And so we taste these moments of hospitality that should draw us into who God is and who we were created to be. But then we also experience in our lives inhospitality and have this real sense of like, just like it shouldn't be like this. And so I think in both like positive and negative, it points us back to that creational intention. And so in that, you could talk about it as hospitality, or you could almost like back that up and just talk about belonging. And so here I'm thinking of like a million different books, but one particularly lately that Drew and I have been reading with some friends is called After Whiteness, and it's about a theology of belonging. So how do we reimagine particularly theological institutions of education as a place of belonging, and what would that look like? And so in that, I mean, it's almost interchangeable for me of like, how do I create a hospitable classroom where like we can grow together, not in like a top down all the time model, but in a like actually being transformed together, that we all have this belonging to one another because of our faith and just our common humanity, right? In being created by God.
It's fun to hear you say that. For a couple reasons. One is like I sit in the classroom with you and experience that.
When you said our friend, I thought you were going to say De La Torre, and then it was Emily, and I was like, okay, there's, Miguel De La Torre is, pretty similar to Emily.
I love that. But I also had the chance this past about a week ago now to visit Shorter University and do some recruiting for our graduate school ministry here on campus. And one of the things that I went into that sort of couple days with like having no idea what it was going to look like, having no idea of like what sort of my engagements with students were going to look like, what those interactions would be. Would they be in the classroom? Would they be just like in passing? Is this going to be, am I going to just have like a table or a booth that I'm just going to be presenting at? Like, what is it? I didn't really know until on the plane on the way there. But just had an incredible time, and got a chance to share a lot of things that I did not expect to. Just out of my own experience, I went in with the mindset of like, I got to talk about all the programs. I got to talk about like all the things that like recruiters talk about. But then I remember just sitting in a classroom and being like, but what is it that I love about what we do here at PBA? And that same sort of idea that you were talking about is something that I feel like I've experienced here, even in the classroom. Of it's one of those few spaces, particularly in ministry, and specifically seminary, where you probably have a lot of things wrong, and that's okay, because so do I. And so this idea of learning and growing together in these sorts of cohorts that we are a part of, and that we grow together with people who are just out of undergrad or have been doing ministry for 15 years and just want to continue their education, or and even the professors who largely have a vast and diverse experience in ministry, coming back to a place where we can learn and grow and be transformed together. And that sort of just that's the space that you talked about sounds a lot like the space that I fell in love with here, that I got to share about at another school last week. And so that was just fun for me to affirm that I feel that here, and I love that. And not say we're perfect, because we're not, but that's also okay as long as we know that and are moving forward in it. And so with that, you talk about experiences of hospitality versus inhospitality. And so I was wondering if you would share with us a little bit about your friend Courtney, from when you were a little girl, and sort of what she was to you and for you, and just how she sort of expressed hospitality to you.
Yeah. So growing up, I felt like I had like a good home. It was a Christian home, but it was sometimes a difficult home. And so at the time when I started second grade, so I'd been going to this elementary school for 1 year already. And then in my second grade year, my dad was actually in prison for a year. And so with him being out of the home, it really like disrupted our whole family life, financial situation, all of those things. And so in the midst of that, we had this new girl at school, and they had just moved house, actually. She already lived in my hometown, but I never knew her. So it was my youth minister's daughter eventually. And so the fact that while my physical space at home was very disrupted, Courtney really was hugely important to me in just giving me that place and sharing her family with me from the age of like 7, 8. onward. And even today, like, she's a children's minister in Oklahoma. We barely talk, it's just like when I'm in town, sometimes we'd try to like catch up, and even looking through like Facebook Messenger, it's like so random, like, oh, hey, I'm in town, or like, oh, hey, here, this thing is going on. But for me, she's just always been that person that really was like a godsend at that point in life, to just be like a light of Christ in the midst of that situation, and just to really walk alongside me through all phases of life. I think it's really interesting. It's like not a hospitality thing, but just a Christian journey. I feel like if you've come out of like a difficult growing up, it's so easy to come to college and just be like, I'm gonna not even reinvent myself, but just kind of like be who I've been this whole time, and just like cut off ties or start fresh. And I guess like the older I've gotten, the more I've seen the value of the people who have known you for a really long time. And so I feel like I hold her dear in that space, as well as like always this reminder of like, that's also like a part of who I am. So I think, side note.
No, that's great. It's really good, just that point of knowing someone, and like truly knowing someone, and having taken the time and spent the time to get to a place of really knowing someone, and how in those spaces with those people, there is a sense of belonging that comes when we are fully known and still fully accepted. And it's oftentimes, I think in my own experience, and what it sounds like with Courtney, is that it's people that choose to accept us in their knowing of us, that allows us to feel belonging. And I think that to me is an act. It's a I don't want to say lifestyle, because that sounds like super cliche, but it's this lifestyle of hospitality. It's just in the nature of these people to love and accept. And I think that comes from the same place, our desire for hospitality, in that God is a hospitable God, and being created in God's image, and to rightly image Him, we're called to live hospitably.
When you're saying that, it makes me think, don't want to always talk about only the Old Testament, but like when you're talking about that, it made me think so much like with Jesus, this gets at like the really counterintuitive, like what's our cultural notion versus like the biblical example of like Jesus is homeless and he's the most hospitable, right? Like, because he just sets out in his day with intentionality, but with an openness toward like those who he encounters. And so that actually, it's interesting how much, if you just spend a little bit of time in like Middle Eastern culture, how much you can kind of like feel a lot of like biblical hospitality. But for me, I remember one time I was in Egypt visiting my best friend, and she was working at a church, and so we were like had to cross the city, and she was like getting ready to go, and I'm like, Mo, you're late to everything. Like, why are we leaving like an hour before church to get through this like 20-minute walk or whatever? And she was like, oh, like, we might see people on the way. And I just remember we basically like wove through the streets, just like saying hello to people, and we were still late. But it was just this like totally different priority system, where it wasn't like my whole day is about from getting A to B and accomplishing these things, but it was like creating a space for people. And I think just so often we have no margin.
I think that same sort of idea came up in conversation a couple weeks ago on the podcast I was sitting with Caleb Bowman, who grew up many years his life in India, and how one thing that he was sharing with me, and I experienced also in my little bit of my time in India, is this culture of hospitality that largely comes from this daily living that is removed from the chains of like a schedule, and largely driven by interaction with people. And he shared one thing is like you expect people in India to be late a lot of times, but it's not because they feel like they're late at all. There isn't this spirit of condemnation for being late. There's this, oh, you interacted with someone for that sort of amount of time, and you allowed yourself to be interruptible, and you were more focused on the people rather than your schedule, your agenda. And so I see that, and it's funny that you bring this up, because this is one of my favorite pictures of hospitality in Scripture is Jesus, who, as you say, is homeless, right? Being someone without a physical space himself is the most hospitable person that we can look to. And I love the story of Zacchaeus as a picture of hospitality. And I talked about the story a couple weeks ago as well on the podcast, very briefly. But we get so caught up with this picture of hospitality being inviting people into our space that we've prepared perfectly ahead of time, right? And we get something very different from Jesus in this scene with Zacchaeus, where he's going about his day, he's going about his ministry, and he sees there's crowds, and he sees Zacchaeus in this tree, the wee little man that climbed up the sycamore tree, right? And instead of inviting Zacchaeus to this space that he doesn't have, Jesus says, I want to come to your home. I want to come into your life. I want to be a part of what's going on with you. And I think we get this sort of reverse picture of what we've made hospitality to be in that. And I think that going back to that idea of being fully known and fully accepted, I think it's very hard to do that when people aren't in our space and when people aren't a part of what's going on in our lives. And so we get this picture of Jesus stepping into the life of Zacchaeus as an act of hospitality, rather than Jesus saying, Zacchaeus, step out of your life and into mine.
Yeah, when I was talking about Courtney and you were kind of unpacking that, it has a lot of resonance here. With my thought was basically like hospitality is like being present for someone, like being available, being there for them. And in that same way, it's like Jesus is like, I'm going to show up at your house today. Yeah. And I feel like that's a lot of times the hospitality piece. I think the difference between just friendship or whatever, kind of different ways we could think about relational dynamics. But I think the difference with hospitality is often that sense of boundary crossing, of saying like, there's a difference that has to be overcome in this, even if that's just like interruptability of your day, of like, we're on a different schedule or whatever. Yeah. But particularly with Jesus, we see the like boundary crossing of like with Samaritans or with tax collectors or whatever, that he's like willing to cross the boundary to be present to someone that is, really translatable for us in spaces today, to be thinking about what does it mean for me to be hospitable? Well, not just like gather a bunch of people that look like me in my house. Like that's not really being very hospitable. That's like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And there's this sense there, it becomes difficult, I think, to separate when you talk about hospitality being interruptible and crossing boundaries. There becomes this sense of not being able to separate it from, I think, the idea of generosity, and being generous, yes, with things, but also with time, with our time, with our presence, with our own life and mess and experience, being generous with our own story, generous in vulnerability, and all those things come together, I think, as a part of what it looks like to truly be hospitable. And I think if I could ask you about one thing in your life right now, where I think that idea of hospitality and generosity come together beautifully in this sort of radical picture, I think is in the world of adoption. And you announced not too long ago on Facebook that you and Drew are together moving towards that and taking the next steps towards adoption. And so if you could talk to us a little bit about your process in that and what that's looked like for you guys.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say interruptability, because it's like the first one I think about at the moment. Because the space we're sitting in right now is very much like it's all there, like everything's in place, and like we could get a call today that it's like, decide tonight if this is like a good match for you guys. And so, like, I have to be honest, in this space, it's really strange to be the person talking about adoption when it's like the Lanes or the Ayayos, like there would be other people, particularly like even in school of ministry, that are further down the road with this, practically in their own home. But theologically, it's been something that's been really important to Drew and I even before we met. And so in a lot of ways, like, we're at like the edge of something that's been a long time coming. And in that, I feel like there is like the kind of on the surface, like interruptability of like, all of a sudden you've like opened your home to this child. But I think for me, it just, you feel when you're in it so much more the like fullness of what it means to be hospitable. So that it runs against like the grain of what feels natural. Like, so for me to have had 2 biological children and to know what it is in your body and in your physical life to have things that naturally help you to kind of have a time countdown and like expectations in the right place, to then be in this like very like foreign space of like, it doesn't like line up and add up in the same way. Like it just is very much this like living in this liminal uncertainty. And so in that, what I think relates so much to hospitality is that kind of just holding loosely, like being open to a person, but holding loosely like your timing, or holding loosely your expectations, or holding loosely, you know, like I don't know. Like it's just like sacrificial in like other relational dynamics to think about. Like it's much harder for me to think about what is it like for our kids if we had a failed adoption. Like when do we talk to them about timing and those sorts of things? So if you are a hospitable person, there's a risk for you. But I think there's also like risk for your community. And so I think about like a hospitable place for a church, and like if they are open to having like diversity conversations that are real and intentional, like there's this space that is pushing towards something good, but it's hard. And so I think like those kinds of like the kind of depth of hospitality and the difficulty of it is brought out a lot in this process. In all kinds of ways. You can like kind of expect that the lived experience of it is a whole lot different. And I think even letting go of like certain longings or the way you envision things, like it just will be what it will be. And so the like trust about how relationships will develop is something in the hospitality of like the kingdom at large that is probably transferable as well, of like, when you think about the early church, it's like no like Jewish follower of Jesus was thinking like all of a sudden I'm going to start eating with Gentiles. So there's just this like the uncertainty that is almost like boundless, where you're like, who knows like what the Spirit will do? Who knows where this child will come from? Who knows the possibilities of how that could then work out with a birth mother or birth parents in our relationship with them. So thinking about the aspects of how open or closed an adoption is, like the things that are very negotiable all the time, is the difficulty of hospitality when it's not very structured and it's not in your control. So I think, maybe you could talk about that.
So I think the idea of expectations and sort of vision, even having a vision for what something could look like, what something might look like, it feels very safe to have that vision and have those expectations. But the reality, I think, is in the context of hospitality, expectations and vision become very limiting, and you've placed possibility in a box, and you've not just placed it in a box, but then you've set the box to the side and said, all right, nothing out of this box is going to be what my experience of hospitality is, or relationships in hospitality, or even in seeking and finding these places of belonging in those things. Whereas that holding loosely and sort of like opening this box of our expectations and our vision and that safety net that we have, and taking those things out and placing them on the table and saying, all right, there's so much more than what's here. And allowing those things to be taken and new things put in place, I think, is scary. But I think it's also so freeing, and so it allows us to see that boundlessness of possibility in relationships. And I think a lot of times we have this expectation of, there's this like weird expectation we have with otherness, I think, in hospitality, that was thrown out the door by a just really good friend of mine. I've talked about him on the podcast before, but his name is Blake. And he once said to me this thing that like just shook my world. He said, just because I have less than you doesn't mean I can't bless you. And that like was like, what? This doesn't make any sense. Like how does that work? And we see this picture of what we have seen as this other becoming the image of hospitality. And I think, like, I even think back to your friend Courtney, who was the new girl in school, right? She was in second grade. You don't get any other than that. And yet she is the one who was able to step into your life in a way that blessed you and gave you that belonging. And I think that these sort of expectations of otherness is something that we have that limits the possibility of our experience of hospitality, where if I can quote you in the sermon that you once preached, the other is not other to God. And realizing that, I think, takes some of those expectations and that we have out, opening up possibility for so much more.
Yeah, but like the process, I feel like the other is not other to God is the mental starting place, but the process of the other becoming not other to us is something we can't like short circuit. So I feel like there's like got a couple of thoughts going. One is the idea of hospitality often is like, I'm going to go and I'm going to feel like comfortable and cozy in someone's house, like the feels of hospitality. And I feel like otherness is like grates against that. And so it's like the long work of you're not changing the other so that you can like feel the same in this space. It's like, how do I get to know the other and see them in their humanity and like find our commonness, so that we then in the long run can like come together in this really sweet space. So it's like the hard work of reconciliation, or that it's like it does eventually get there. Like I don't think that is that kind of sense of feeling at home is not a foreign thing to hospitality. It's just can't be cheap. Like I think like hearing like Bonhoeffer, like cheap grace, or like it can be cheap hospitality where it's like, look, we're all different and we spent time together. It's like, did everyone in that room feel like at home? And so how do you kind of like do the long work where that actually is so much greater of a goal?
If there was a common theme for this semester on the Watcast, I think it would be inefficiency. The amount of times that this idea of inefficiency has come up as something that we ought to be okay with, that we need to sort of get off our high horse of efficiency and realize that things are slow, and slow is gritty and hard and long, but it is the most rewarding in all of those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, usually those words are used because things have become commodified, right? Like if we're trying to be efficient, it's so we can make more money or so we can do more. And so as soon as we do that, we're in any kind of relational context, I think that's where we can see that there's no way to be treating someone the right way if we see them as like if we're trying to quantify the time that they deserve.
Yeah, that's good.
Probably tangential.
It's so good. Wow. All right, well, that is, I think, all the questions that I had for you. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was such a wonderful time, such a sweet conversation, and just a wonderful reminder to live hospitably in a way that reflects the way that God is hospitable. And so thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your words and your wisdom and your insight. Such a pleasure, such an honor. With that said, next week on the Watcast, Q and I are going to be back in the same room together, and we are actually going to be interviewed by our guest. Super excited for that, kind of going to reverse what we've been seeing all semester. Not exactly sure where that conversation is going to go, but I'm excited for it nonetheless. With that said, we will see y'all next week.